Don't let her leave. 4 words. The most powerful man in the city said them without raising his voice, without looking up from his hands, and every man in that room went still, because when Du Kangjai pronounced a thing, it had already happened. Rewind 90 seconds. She was not supposed to be in that room. Han Yuna was the girl the agency sent when the real interpreter needed someone to carry his bag, refill the water, and disappear into the wall. And for 3 hours she had done exactly that, invisible in her gray blouse at the edge of a table where 12 men decided who lived. Then the phone on the black lacquer rang, in a language none of them would touch. The senior interpreter had stepped out. The Italians looked at each other. 12 Korean men looked at the ringing phone the way you look at a snake, and the coffee girl set down her tray, picked it up, and answered, in Italian. Not schoolbook Italian, the other kind. The kind you only own if you grew up on the wrong streets of Naples, 11 years and an ocean ago. In a place she never talks about. She said 9 soft words into that phone. The Italian stopped smiling, and Du Kangjai, a man who trusts no interpreter, no partner, no blood, a man who speaks only Korean at a table, so his enemies can never be sure what he understands, turned his head, and looked at her for the first time. Here's what nobody in that room knew yet. The polite little courtesy the Italians had just passed across the table, the one their smiling interpreter would translate as a gift of respect, was an execution order, and the only person who heard it correctly was the one nobody had bothered to look at. She heard the whole thing. She wasn't supposed to. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know who's listening tonight. Then stay with me, because in about an hour, this man is going to have to decide whether to trust the woman he was told to throw out, or the family blood who told him to. The Club Bequa did not have a sign, did not take reservations, and on the 4th floor it had a room that did not appear on any floor plan. A long room with a single black table, no windows, and a door that a man named Du Kangjai opened for no one. And it was in this room, at 11 at night, that Han Yuna had spent 3 hours learning the exact weight of being furniture. She had learned it before. She was good at it. She refilled water without being asked and removed it without being thanked. Insane. She stood where the light did not reach. She folded each used napkin into a tight small square before she set it on her tray. A thing her hands did on their own, had always done, that no one had ever asked about because no one had ever watched her hands. When the senior interpreter, Baek Seong-ho, wanted his fountain pen, he held out 2 fingers, and she put it in them. When he was done with her, he turned his shoulder, which in the grammar of that room meant go stand by the wall. She went and stood by the wall. From the wall, she could see everything, which is the one thing they never account for when they decide you are nothing. That nothing has a very good view. She watched the Italians. There were 3 of them, flown in that afternoon. And the oldest had silver hair swept straight back, and a small saint's medallion at his throat, and hands that stayed perfectly folded while he spoke. And she watched the way the 2 younger ones oriented toward him, the way iron filings orient toward a magnet, and she understood, without a word of it being said in any language, that this quiet old man was the most dangerous person in a room full of dangerous people. She understood something else too, and it sat cold in her stomach for an hour before it had a name. They kept smiling. The Italians kept smiling, and Baek kept translating the smiles into Korean as warmth. A great honor, a gesture of friendship. We have waited years for a partner of your caliber. And the young Neapolitan on the left kept murmuring to the young one on the right, low, fast, under the smiles. Words. In words, Baek did not translate because Baek was not meant to hear them and, it would turn out, could not have understood them if he had. Yuna heard them. She heard Chiyo-ya, that one there, aimed with a flick of the eyes at the head of the Korean table. She heard stat a quarto, watch yourself. She heard once a word she had not heard spoken aloud in 11 years. A word from a childhood behind a green iron gate in the Sanità district of Naples, and it went through her like cold water. And she kept folding napkins, and she kept folding napkins, because the second thing she had learned before being furniture was how to keep Have in. Was how to keep her face empty, while her chest caved in. She told herself it was nothing. Two men murmuring. She told herself she had heard wrong. 11 years is a long time. Her Italian was a child's Italian, orphanage Italian, gutter Italian. Surely she had it wrong. She had not heard wrong. At the head of the table, Du Kangjai had not touched his coffee. Not once, all night. She had set it down at his right hand 3 times, fresh each time, and 3 times it had gone cold, and she had noticed the way you notice a thing that doesn't fit, filed it, and let it go. The boss doesn't drink the coffee here. She didn't yet know why that mattered. It would matter more than almost anything. Here is what she had learned about the man at the head of the table. In 3 hours of standing at a wall, he did not threaten anyone. She waited for it, the way you wait for a dog to bark, and it never came. When one of his own men brought him a paper he did not like, he did not raise his voice. He set the paper down, aligned its edge with the edge of the table, and said, "Who approved this?" And the man who had brought it went the color of the wall, and no one in the room breathed until Kangjai, very slightly, moved on. He left the punishment blank. He let the room fill it in. It was the most frightening thing she had ever seen a person do with silence. She had learned that no one stood behind him. His men arranged themselves around the room in a shape that always left the space at his back empty, and none of them ever crossed into it, and he never once checked, because he had built a world in which he did not have to. She had learned that he was, in the deepest possible way, alone, and that he had made it a fortress and called it strength. And she recognized it the way you recognize a face, in a language you thought you'd forgotten, because it was, more or less, the shape of her own life. At 11:40, Baek Songho set down his pen, murmured something about the men's room, and left. He should not have left. He knew he should not have left. Later, she would understand that he left on purpose, that a call was coming, and he wanted to be able to say, honestly, that he had not been in the room to translate it. But in the moment, it only registered as the small, ordinary rudeness of an important man, and the table went on, without him, in fractured English and hand gestures, and the old Italian smiled his folded hands, and then the phone on the black lacquer lit up and began to ring. It was the Italian's phone. The old man glanced at it, said something low, and the young one on the left, the one who had murmured "watch yourself," picked it up, listened for 4 seconds, and his face changed. Just slightly. Just enough. He held the phone out across the table toward the Korean side, toward whoever spoke Italian, and said in careful, courteous, textbook Italian, loud enough for the room. "For your interpreter. A message of respect from our people at home." And Baek was in the men's room, and 12 Korean men looked at a ringing phone in a language none of them could touch, and the room hung there, and the old Italian watched them hang, and Yuna understood, with the clean, cold certainty of someone who has spent her whole life reading a room she was not allowed to speak in, that the phone was not a message, it was a test, to see who in this building understood Italian. They wanted to know if it was safe. She should have kept folding napkins. Every instinct she had. 11 years of instinct, orphanage instinct, furniture instinct, screamed at her to keep folding napkins, to let the phone ring, to stay nothing, stay safe, stay alive. She set down her tray. She crossed the room, and she picked up the phone. "Pronto," she said. One word, and the whole room turned like a single animal. The voice on the other end was a man's, old, unhurried, and it was not speaking to a Korean interpreter, because it did not think one was listening. It was speaking to the young man across the table, in the low, fast dialect of home, believing the phone had been passed to him, and it said, easily, warmly, the way you'd tell a friend the weather, Digli c'è tutto a posto. I fiori arrivano domani. Tell him everything's fine. The flowers arrive tomorrow. 9 words. And in the world Han Yuna came from behind the green iron gate, where the men who ran the streets sent fiori, flowers, to exactly one kind of appointment. She knew that the flowers arrive tomorrow, meant the funeral is set, meant it's done, it happens tomorrow, meant that somewhere in this deal, the 12 men thought they were still negotiating. The decision had already been made, and the target had already been chosen, and the only thing left was the flowers. She did not let her face move. She said, in Napolitano, soft, in the exact cadence of the streets she had spent 11 years pretending she'd never walked. A cadence no textbook has, that you cannot fake, that told the man on the phone in half a second that whoever had answered was from home. She said, Ho, capito. Grazy. Understood. Thank you. And she hung up. The young Neapolitan across the table had gone very still. He had heard her accent. He knew what it meant. It meant the Koreans had someone in the room from the Sanità, someone who heard Fiori and understood. And his hand moved slightly toward his jacket. The room did not understand what had just happened. 11 of the 12 Korean men had heard a temp say 4 words of a language they didn't speak and hang up a phone. They understood nothing. The 12th understood everything. Du Kangjae had not moved in 4 minutes. He sat, with his hands folded, and his cold coffee at his right hand, and he had watched a woman he had not once looked at all night cross his room, pick up his enemy's phone, and say 4 words that made a Naples soldier reach for his gun. And Kangjae did not know Italian, did not know what she'd said, could not verify a single syllable of it. But he did not read words. He had never read words. He read the room, and he had just watched the most relaxed man at that table stop being relaxed because of what came out of this woman's mouth, and that told him more than any translation ever had. He looked at her. Really looked. The scar through her eyebrow, the gray agency blouse, the way she had already stepped back toward her wall and made herself small again, as if she could put the last 30 seconds back in the bottle. He said it in Korean quietly to his own men, without taking his eyes off her. Don't let her leave. 2 of his men moved to the door. And that is where everything changed. Because Han Yuna came to that room to pour coffee and vanish, and instead she had just made herself the single most valuable and most endangered person in the building. She knew a murder was scheduled for tomorrow. She didn't know who the flowers were for, and the man who had just ordered her kept had not decided yet whether she was a gift or a plant sent by the people who wanted him dead. Baek Seong-ho came back into the room smiling, and it took him exactly 4 seconds to stop. He read the seating. He read the temp. His temp, the one he'd brought to carry his bag, sitting now in a chair at the table, and the boss's eyes on her. And he understood that in the 90 seconds, he had engineered his own absence. Something had gone wrong in the one way he had not planned for. And Baek Seong-ho was a man who did not like plans going wrong, because his plan was worth a great deal of money and at least 1 life. He recovered beautifully. That was his gift. He laughed, warm, and said to Kangjae in Korean, "Ah, I see my assistant has been entertaining our guests. She has a little tourist Italian, very charming. I hope she didn't say anything to embarrass us. These agency girls, you know, they take a Berlitz course and think they're diplomats. He said it fondly. He said it the way you pat a child on the head in front of company. He said it to put her back on the wall. What did she say? Kangjai said. Not to back. To her. The room turned again. Yuna felt 11 years of instinct scream. Say nothing. Be small, survive. And she looked at the untouched cold coffee at the boss's right hand, and she made the second unsurvivable choice of the night. He said the flowers arrive tomorrow, she said in quiet Korean. In the Sanita, where I heard that phrase before, flowers arriving means a funeral is arranged. It means the decision to kill someone has already been made, and the day is set. Whatever your interpreter has been translating as friendship for the last 3 hours. She did not look at Bake. Those men across the table already know how this ends. They knew before they got on the plane. Silence. The kind you could stand a coin on its edge in. Bake laughed again, but the second laugh had a crack down the middle of it. This is exactly what I mean, he said, spreading his hands to the room, to the Italians, to Kangjai, Fiore. Flowers. Don Marchetti's people are famously devout. They send flowers to the Church of San Gennaro before every important agreement. It's a blessing, a courtesy. I've seen it a dozen times. She's taken a beautiful old custom and turned it into a threat, because she watched too many gangster movies. With respect, he turned his silver smile on Kangjai. Do you really want to blow up a 2-year negotiation over a coffee girl's imagination? It was a good lie. It was an excellent lie, because it was built on a true thing. Naples families are devout. They do send flowers to churches, and the best lies are true things pointed the wrong way. And Yuna watched it land, watched the doubt move across the Korean men's faces, watched even Kangjai's stillness acquire a single hairline of uncertainty, and she understood that she had just told the truth, and it had made her look insane. Kangjai looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Beck. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and said to the room, "We stop here tonight." To the Italians, through Bake, courtesies. To his men, she stays in the building. And to Yuna, nothing. He walked out without deciding which of them was lying. He was going to make them prove it. They put her in a back stairwell to wait, because no one had decided yet what she was, and a thing that hasn't been decided gets put somewhere out of the way. She sat on the concrete steps under a bare bulb and ate a convenience store rice ball she'd had in her bag since noon, and she folded the plastic wrapper into a tight, small square when she was done. And she hummed very low, without deciding to. 4 bars of a song a Neapolitan nun used to sing to the small ones behind the green gate, a lullaby about the moon that owes the sea a debt. And she did not notice she was doing it until a man's voice from the doorway said, "That's not Korean." The driver. Buzz-cut black jacket, an unlit cigarette turning over and over in his fingers. He'd been sent to watch the stairwell. "No," she said. "It's not." He nodded like that settled something. He did not ask what it was. He came and sat 2 steps down from her, not close, and put the cigarette in his mouth, and did not light it. And they sat there in the concrete quiet. A driver who wasn't going to smoke, and an interpreter no one had decided about. And neither of them said anything for a while, and nothing happened. And it was the first time in 11 years someone had sat near Han Yuna, without wanting a single thing from her. He never drinks it, the driver said eventually, apropos of nothing, meaning the coffee, meaning the boss. The coffee. 2 years now. Not here, not anywhere he doesn't watch it get poured. He shrugged. People think it's a power thing. It's not. He didn't explain what it was. He put the dead cigarette back in his pocket and stood up and went back to the doorway, and that was all. She filed it. 2 years. Not since he doesn't watch it get poured. She didn't know yet what it meant. But she had spent her whole life filing things that didn't fit, and this one did not fit. And so she kept it. They let her go at 2 in the morning. That was the mistake. Or it was meant to look like one. The car the driver was supposed to take her home in wasn't there. A text, he said, frowning at his phone. The boss's uncle had reassigned it. Someone would come. Wait in the garage. Level 2. Someone's coming. And so she stood in the underground garage on level 2 under the flat white light between the concrete pillars, and she waited. And she watched the security camera in the corner. And she noticed it wasn't blinking. The little red light. It should blink. It wasn't blinking, and Han Yuna, who had spent 3 months of a lean year cleaning offices at night and had learned every building's nervous system the way the invisible always do, knew that a camera whose light is dead is not a broken camera. It is a turned-off camera. Someone had turned it off, on purpose now. She heard the footstep before she saw him. One man, between her and the ramp, not Italian, Korean, heavy, calm. She backed toward the pillar. He came on. No gun. A gun makes noise, and noise means witnesses, and a dead camera means they don't want witnesses, which meant they didn't want it found, which meant hands. He reached for her. She moved. Here is the thing about being furniture your whole life. Insane. You learn every exit in every room you're ever in, because the invisible are never sure they'll be allowed to leave. And she had walked into this garage 40 minutes ago and mapped it without meaning to, the service door behind the pillar, the one that says staff, the one a temp knows and a hired man from the uncle's payroll does not. She went through it. She heard him hit it a half-second too late. And on the other side, in the narrow concrete service corridor that ran behind the garage, a corridor lined with the building's staff, the night cleaners, the kitchen porters, the invisible people, her people. She said, fast, breathless, in the one language that half of Becquois' night staff actually spoke, because half of them were from the same coast she was. Aiutatemi. Shu, dite la porta. Help me. Close the door. And 3 Neapolitan kitchen porters who had spent all night being furniture too, closed the service door on the uncle's man and stood in front of it with their arms crossed, and it held. She survived, and it ruined her. Because when the boss's men came down at 2:20 to find out why an alarm had tripped, here is what they found. A temp, alone, hysterical. No attacker. He was long gone up the ramp, a dead camera that the log said had been scheduled for maintenance, and 3 kitchen staff swearing in a foreign language that a man had chased her. Staff whose word was worth nothing. Staff no one would ever check. There was no blood, no weapon, no footage, nothing. She had proven she was being hunted, and by proving it with no evidence but her own certainty, she had proven she was exactly what Bake said she was. A coffee girl with an overheated imagination, seeing killers in a parking garage, dragging the kitchen into her fantasy. The violence didn't kill her. It discredited her. And it told her one cold thing. The man who reassigned her car, who could turn off a camera, who had the access, was the boss's own uncle. He sent for her at dawn. Alone. No Bake, no uncle, no men in the room. Just the boss behind a desk in a glass office with the gray city behind him, and a phone lying on the desk between them, and the empty space at his back that no one was allowed to fill. They tell me, Kang Jae said, that you had a bad dream in my garage. She was so tired. She had been furniture for 31 years, and hunted for 4 hours, and she was so tired of the wall, and something in her that had been folded into a small, tight square her whole life came unfolded. You don't drink the coffee, she said. He went still. Different still. The kind of still where you've said a thing a person built a wall around. You haven't touched a cup you didn't watch get poured in 2 years, she said, And last night you left 3 of mine to go cold at your right hand, and I thought you were rude. And then I thought, no. A man who won't drink coffee he didn't watch poured is a man who was poisoned once by coffee 2 years ago, probably by someone close enough to hand him a cup. Insane. You don't distrust everyone because you're paranoid. You distrust everyone because one time, being trusting nearly killed you, and you decided never again, and you built a very good fortress, and you have been alone inside it ever since. She heard her own voice shaking and did not stop it. I know that fortress. I grew up in one. So don't tell me I had a bad dream. Tell me who handed you the cup 2 years ago. Because whoever it was is the same person who turned off your camera last night. It's the same method. It's the same hand. For a long time he didn't speak. Outside, the city went from gray to the color of ash. She waited for him to throw her out, or to soften, or to say the thing men say. He did none of it. He picked up the phone from the desk. The phone. The Italian's phone. The one she'd answered, which his men had quietly kept. And he set it in front of her. And he said one word. Translate, not please. Not, I believe you. He was still using her. But he had just handed her the phone no one else in the building could read, and made her, in that gesture, the only person in his fortress who could hear his enemies. The phone held a voicemail, and 3 days of the Italian side's group messages, in text, because the young soldier who'd handed it across the table had been sloppy, had assumed no one Korean would ever read it, had assumed exactly what everyone always assumed about the people in the room who don't matter. Yuna read for 2 hours. Kang Jai did not leave. He sat in the empty back chair and watched her read a language he would never speak, and it must have been the most defenseless he had been in years, to sit and wait on the word of a stranger. And he did it, and he watched her hands. Here is what she found. She found the recording of a meeting from 3 months ago, the last time the 2 families had talked, and she found the audio of Baek's Sung-ho translating it, and she laid the Italian and the Korean side by side in 2 columns on a legal pad, and the columns did not match. The Italian Don, 3 months ago, had said in dialect, "Prima I fiori, poi la firma." Flowers first, then the signature. First the funeral, then the deal, meaning we kill our obstacle inside your organization, and only then do we sign. Baek had translated it, in Korean on the record, as, "They wish to honor the memory of our past dealings before we proceed." He had taken first the killing, and made it a moment of respectful reflection. For 3 months, Kang Jae had been walking into an alliance whose first clause was a murder, and his own interpreter had been sanding the murder off every sentence before it reached his ears. "He's not bad at Italian," Yuna said quietly. Baek had boasted, that first night in front of the room, "I've requested a native speaker verification consultant 3 times. They never approved the budget," making himself sound like the one man who cared about accuracy. "He told you he asked for a native checker 3 times and got refused. He didn't. I checked with the agency this morning. He's the one who's blocked it. Every time someone proposed bringing in a Naples native to sit in, Baek killed it, because a native checker was the one thing that could catch him. He didn't fail to protect you from bad translation. He is the bad translation. On purpose. For 2 years. Kang Jae looked at the 2 columns for a long time. "Who's paying him?" he said. Flat. Already halfway to knowing. And she turned the legal pad over, to the last thing she'd found, the text thread the young soldier had left open. A single line in reply to "When do we move?" and she read it out in the original and then in Korean. "Aspettiamo il via dallo zio." We wait for the go from the uncle. Baek was the leak. He'd been mistranslating to steer Kang Jae toward a deal that began with a killing, and the Italians were waiting on the uncle. The flowers weren't for one of the boss's men. The uncle had sold the Italians the one obstacle standing between him and the whole ring. And the obstacle was Kang Jae himself. The funeral was the boss's. She thought that would be the moment the fortress opened. She was wrong. That is not how it goes. Because the uncle, Do Myung-sik, was not a fool, and a man does not survive 58 years in that life by being caught flat. And by the time Yuna carried the legal pad and the phone out of that glass office, Myung-sik had already built the thing that would turn the boy against the girl. He was waiting in the corridor. Camel coat over his shoulders, gold glasses, a patient uncle's smile. He held up something small between two fingers gently, the way you'd hold a moth. Her Santino, the prayer card, from the green gate. It must have fallen in the garage. San Gennaro, Myung-sik read off the little laminated card, warmly, turning it to the light. The patron of Naples. My. He looked up at her, and behind him, coming down the corridor, was Kang Jae, and Myung-sik pitched his voice to Carrie. Kang Jae, nephew. Before you trust this girl's translation of what the Naples people really mean, the smile widened, the eyes stayed dead. You should ask her why she carries a Sanita prayer card in her pocket. You should ask her which family raised an orphan behind the green gate in the Sanita district. Insane. You should ask her whether the reason she understands the Marchetti so perfectly, the reason she just happened to be the one temp the agency sent tonight, the reason she answered their phone in their own dialect, without a heartbeat of hesitation, is that she has been there since she was a child. You've been handed an interpreter who reads them like a book, Kang Jae. Did it not occur to you to ask who taught her to read? And the terrible thing, the thing that made the corridor tilt under her, was that every word of it was true. She was raised in the Sanita. She did carry the card. She did understand the Marchetti perfectly because they were the water she'd been born into, and she had spent 11 years in an ocean trying not to be from there. And now the one true thing about herself, the origin she'd buried, was being held up in a corridor as proof that she was a weapon aimed at the only man who'd ever needed her. Everything she was, turned into evidence against her. Kang Jae stood in the corridor between his blood and the stranger. His uncle, who had raised him after his father died, who had stood at his shoulder for 30 years, and a temp he'd known for one night, whose entire self had just been revealed as a lie of omission, shaped exactly like a plant. He looked at Yuna. Is it true? He said. The gate, the family, all of it, and she could have lied. She was very, very good at making herself into whatever the room needed. 11 years of it. Yes, she said. All of it. I was raised by the water those men come from. Nobody taught me to spy for them. They taught me to disappear, so nothing would notice me long enough to hurt me. And I got so good at it, I've been disappearing ever since, including from you tonight, when I could have kept my mouth shut and let your flowers arrive. She was shaking. She let it show. You want to know if I'm a plant. I can't prove I'm not. That's the whole trap. Everything true about me looks like the lie. So don't decide with proof. You said you don't read words. You read the room. Fine. Read it. He's the one who reassigned my car into a dead camera. He's the one the Italians are waiting on. And I'm the one who told you the funeral was yours. She held out her hand for the card. That's from a nun who cut apples into 8 pieces even when there were only 2 of us. It's not a Marchetti membership card, but you'll believe whatever keeps your uncle. Myung-sik did not give the card back. He closed his fist around it, gently, and smiled and said, You see how she talks, Kangai. They'd train them to sound like that. And he turned and walked away down the corridor, with her whole childhood in his fist. And no one stopped him, and Kang Jae did not answer. The summit was that night, in a private dining room with red walls and one long table, and it was arranged exactly as a trap is arranged, which is to say, it looked exactly like a dinner. Don Cesare Marchetti sat at one end, with his folded hands and his saint's medallion. Kangjae at the other. The uncle at Kangjae's right, warm, avuncular, pouring wine. Baek at the middle of the table where the interpreter sits, silver glasses, fountain pen, translating the courtesies. And at the far end, past the men who mattered in a plain gray blouse, because Kangjae had, to the surprise of his whole organization, insisted she be in the room without saying why, sat Han Yuna. Small, silent, folding her napkin into a tight square under the table where no one could see her hands shake. He had not told her he believed her. He had told her nothing. He had simply had a man put her in the room, and she did not know if she was there as his ear or as the plant he was about to expose to prove his loyalty to his uncle, and that not knowing was its own kind of cliff. The dinner moved. Baek translated warmth into warmth, and Yuna listened to the other channel, the low, fast dialect running under the table between the Italian soldiers, the words not meant for any Korean ear, and she heard the machine of the evening assemble itself, piece by piece, and it was worse than the flowers. She heard, "O zio ha detto dopo brindisi," the uncle said after the toast. After the toast, when Myung-sik raised his glass to the alliance, that was the signal. The men outside the red walls would move, and the wine the uncle was pouring so warmly into his nephew's glass. The wine Kangjae would have to drink to the toast. A man who won't touch coffee he didn't watch poured, being handed a glass by the one person on earth he'd never suspect, his own blood, in a room too public to refuse. That was the cup. 2 years ago, it was coffee. Tonight it was wine. Same hand. She understood the whole shape of it in the space between two courses, and she understood that if she stood up and shouted, "Don't drink," she was the hysterical plant, the Marchetti's girl, and they would take her out, and the toast would proceed, and the flowers would arrive. She had one move. It was not a gun. She had never held a gun. She had the one thing 11 years behind a green gate had left in her hands. The thing the whole world had spent her whole life deciding was worthless. She had their language. Myung-sik stood. He lifted his glass. He began, warmly, the toast, to the union of two great families. And Baek translated it, and every glass at the table came up, and Kangjae's hand closed around his wine. And at the far end of the table, the coffee girl stood up. She did not shout. She had learned from the most frightening man she'd ever met that you do not threaten, you pronounce. So she spoke, in the low, unhurried dialect of the Sanità, directly down the length of the table to Don Cesare Marchetti, passed back, past the uncle, in the language of his own childhood, and she said, "Don Cesare, I fiori sono per lui. The flowers are for him." She tipped her head very slightly toward Kangjae. "Ma o giardiniere e o zio." But the gardener is the uncle. Silence. Not a coin-on-edge silence. A grave. Don Cesare's folded hands came apart. She kept going, quiet, relentless, in his tongue, so that only the two of them and the Italian soldiers truly followed. While back, Sapienza trained, textbook, Northern, sat frozen, and did not translate a word of it, because he could not, because it was moving too fast in a dialect his university had never touched. And his silence, in that moment, was the loudest confession in the room. You waited on his blood to hand you the ring. But, think, Don Cesare, a man who sells you his own nephew's throat tonight, whose throat does he sell you tomorrow? You are about to build an alliance whose first stone is a man who murders family. When you need him to hold, he will fold, because that is who he is. And you already know it, because I can see your hands. Kangjae did not understand one syllable of it. He didn't need to. He was reading the room the way he had read it the first night, and he watched the most dangerous man in Naples turn slowly to look at the uncle pouring wine. And he watched Baek go the color of the wall, and he watched his uncle's warm, avuncular smile, finally, for 1/2 second, slip. And Du Kangjai set his glass down, full, untouched, and, in the clean, cold silence, he said the only thing he ever said when a thing was already decided. "Uncle, who gave you permission?" Empty. He left the punishment blank. He let the room fill it in. And the room, the Italian soldiers who now knew their whole deal was rotten, the boss's own men who now understood which cup they'd almost let their boss drink, filled it in. My young Sikh reached, too late, into his coat. 2 of Kangjai's men were already behind him, and Don Cesarti Marchetti, who had flown across the world to sign an alliance and had just been handed proof that his partner was a man who'd sell his own blood, folded his hands again and said, in careful Korean he had spoken perfectly well all along and never once let anyone hear him use, "It seems," he said, "we have no agreement." They took back. They took the uncle's men. The Italians left the way weather leaves, suddenly, completely, and you spend a long time after checking the sky. And Du Myung-sik was not in the room when they finished, because a man who plans a murder plans an exit, and by the time Kang Jae's men reached the service door, the uncle was gone. Into the city, into the next thing, carrying a grudge and a prayer card, and the certainty that a temp had cost him everything. But that is tomorrow's story. Tonight, the Red Room emptied out until it was just the 2 of them and the overturned chairs. Kang Jae did not rush to the next thing. He took off the wristwatch he had put on. For the summit, the first time in 11 days he'd worn one. She noticed everything, and he set it on the table, and he sat, and for a full 30 seconds neither of them said anything at all. She folded her napkin into a small, tight square. He watched her hands do it, and did not ask why. Then a man came back in, one of Kang Jae's own, a lieutenant, brisk, and started reporting. And he gestured at Yuna, without looking at her, and said, "We'll have the girl processed and sent back to the agency in the—" "No," Kang Jae said. "Just that." The lieutenant stopped, because even now, even after everything, the reflex of the room was to talk over her, to file her back where furniture goes, and Kang Jae had to reach out and correct it by hand. "She's not the girl who brings the coffee," he said, and the phrase came all the way back around. The words bake had used to shrink her on the first night, turned now into their opposite. "She's the reason I'm alive to drink it. She stays. In the building, in the room, wherever I am." He paused. If she wants to, he was still deciding it for her. Old habits. But he heard himself do it, and he added the last 3 words, and those 3 words were the whole of it. If she wants to. The man who commands an army, asking. The lieutenant left. And then Du Kang Jae did the thing that paid the debt. The debt from the first night, when he'd knocked her card to the floor and turned his shoulder and not looked at her, the way the powerful never look. He reached into his jacket and he took out her Santino. He had taken it back from his uncle's men at some point in all of it, without a word. The little laminated saint from the Green Gate, from the nun who cut apples into 8 pieces, and he did not hand it to her across the height between a boss and a temp. He crouched down. To her level. On the floor of that ruined Red Room, the most powerful man in the city put himself below her eye line and held the card out flat on his palm and waited for her to take it. And did not say a single word, because some things are said better with a knee on the floor than with a mouth. She took it. Her hand shook. She let it. And because he was a man who had built a fortress and lived alone in it for years and did not have the words, he said the only thing he could find, and he said it. The man who speaks only Korean at a table, who has never let an enemy hear him understand another tongue. He said it in her language. Broken, careful, wrong accented. One word, the inverse of the 4 he'd said the first night. Don't let her leave, becoming, now, chosen instead of commanded. Resta. Stay. She stayed. Not because he asked. She'd spent 11 years doing what rooms wanted, but because for the first time a room wanted her, the real one, the Sanata one, the one who heard what was under the words. She kept the card in her pocket. She still folded every napkin into a small, tight square, and he still never asked why, and neither of them ever explained the coffee, or the watch, or the lullaby about the moon that owed the sea a debt. But here is the thing the story does not close, because the flowers were only ever the beginning. 3 floors down, in the gray light, a phone rang. The Italian's phone, the one she'd answered. The one that had started all of it, the one Kang Jae's men had kept in an evidence drawer. It rang, and when someone finally answered it, there was no voice on the other end. Only breathing. And then, in the low, unhurried dialect of the Sanata, the dialect of the Green Gate, a voice she had not heard in 11 years, a voice that knew her name, her real one, the one from before the orphanage, said 4 soft words. And whatever those words were, Han Yuna set down the phone and went very still, and did not translate them for anyone. Somebody in that city knows who she was before the gate, and they just called to remind her. If you're still here at the end of this, drop the name of your city in the comments. I read everyone, and I want to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and if you caught what the uncle carried out the door with him. Type the word Fiore in the comments so I know who was really paying attention. Part 2 is where the phone call gets answered. I'll see you there. Kamita Shiema, what's your name? That's how it started again. Not with a gun. With a question, the gentlest one in the world, asked in a dialect that only 3 million people on Earth speak, at 4 in the morning, into a phone that was supposed to be locked in an evidence drawer. Han Yuna answered without thinking. Old reflex. Home reflex. She said the name they'd given her at the Green Gate, and the old voice on the line said, kindly, patiently, the way you correct a child who has forgotten something they were too small to remember. No, Guagyo. That's the name the nuns gave you. I'm asking the one your father sang. Rewind 12 hours. She had a home now, for the first time in her life. A room she was allowed to stand in the middle of had crouched on the floor of a ruined red room and asked her. Asked, not ordered, to stay. And she had stayed, and for 12 hours Han Yuna had let herself believe that the wall was behind her for good. 12 hours. That's how long you get. Because the past does not knock. It does not ask if it's a good time. It waits. Insane. It waits, patient as a saint's medallion, for the exact moment you finally put something down. Then it calls the number, and it says your father sang you a song, and you realize you've been humming it your whole life without knowing whose voice put it in your mouth. Drop your city below. Tell me you're here. Because in the next hour, a woman who spent 11 years being nobody is going to find out she was somebody all along, and it's going to cost her the only person who ever chose her. The evidence drawer was 3 floors down, and Yuna should never have been near it, but she had not slept, because a person who finally gets a home does not sleep the first night. She sits up guarding it, and at 4 in the morning she had heard, faintly, 3 floors down through the building's bones, a phone ringing that would not stop, and she had gone down. And she had known before she touched it which phone it was. Their phone, the Italians. The one she'd answered on the first night. The one that had started everything. She should have left it. She picked it up, and the old voice asked for the name her father sang. And Han Yuna, who had spent 11 years and an ocean, sanding herself down to nothing, felt the nothing crack straight down the middle. Because she did have a song. 4 bars of a lullaby about the moon that owes the sea a debt. a song she hummed when she was afraid, and had never once been able to say where she'd learned. And she had always told herself a nun taught it to her. And the old man on the phone had just told her, gently, that no nun had. Her father had. His name was Han Jae-il, the old voice said, and it was the first time in 31 years she had heard her father's name, and it went into her the way a key goes into a lock you didn't know was in your own chest. He was Korean, like you. He came to Naples before you were born, and he worked for a family, my family, for 20 years. Because a Korean man who owed nobody's blood was the one man we could trust to hold what none of us could hold ourselves. And when they killed him, we hid you behind the gate of San Gennaro with a prayer card and a lullaby, and we let you become Nanobai. Because nobody is the safest thing a dead man's daughter can be. A pause. Breathing. You've been safe for 30 years, Guagyo. You're not safe anymore. You have 11 days. 11 days until what? She said. Until they find what your father hid, the old man said. And the only reason they haven't found it in 30 years is that they need you to find it. Come home, and you decide who gets it. Stay there, and they'll come get you. And the man standing behind you won't be able to stop them, because he can't fight a war on our streets any more than a fish can climb a tree. A softer note. And Guagyo, the one who told them where you were, he's Korean. He's already here. He says you belong to him. The line went dead. She stood at the window with the dead phone in her hand, and the gray city coming up under her, and she understood two things at once, and both of them tasted like the sea. Her father had a name, and Do Myung-sik. Kang Jae's uncle, who'd walked out a ruined red room with her prayer card in his fist, had not run home to hide. He had run to Naples, to the one people on earth who could tell him who she really was, and he was selling that answer to buy back the power she'd cost him. Her past was now a knife, and the uncle had the handle. Sinso idininda. Kangjo. Sangjo was in the doorway. She didn't know how long he'd been there. He had a way of arriving in a room the way weather arrives, and he stood in the doorway with the empty space at his back that no one was allowed to fill, and he looked at the phone in her hand, and he did not ask what the call was. He waited for her to translate it. That was their whole thing now. He handed her the untranslatable, and she made it plain. It was the nearest thing to trust a man like him had ever built with anyone, and it lived entirely in the space between a question he didn't ask and an answer she chose to give. And for the first time, Han Yuna did not give it. She said it was a wrong number, and she folded that lie into a small, tight square and put it away. Because 11 years of being furniture had taught her exactly one survival skill, and it was make yourself smaller than the trouble. And the trouble was a dead father and an uncle in Naples, and a home she'd had for 12 hours, and every instinct she owned said, "Don't put the trouble in this room. It will burn the room down." Kang Jae looked at her for a long moment. He knew. Of course he knew. He didn't read words, he read rooms. And the room said she was lying, and the room said she was terrified, and the room said this was the part that would sit in him all day, that she was terrified of losing this, of losing him. Insane. And that she'd chosen to carry the whole weight alone, rather than hand him a reason to look at her the way his uncle had made him almost look at her once, in a corridor, holding a prayer card. He knew all of that. And he let her have the lie, which was its own kind of tenderness and its own kind of mistake, because a man who lets the person he's chosen lie to him at 4 in the morning is a man who has decided he'd rather have the peace than the truth. He said, "Come drink something." "You don't drink the coffee," she said. On reflex, the old joke, the thin thread. "No," he said, and the ghost of something crossed his face, almost a smile, the second one she'd ever seen. "But I watch you pour it, And he turned and went, and she followed, and for 1 more hour, they both pretended the phone had been a wrong number, and it was the last easy hour they would get. The emissary came on the 3rd day, and she came wearing the one disguise Yuna could not see through, which was the truth. Her name was Carmela. She was 50, warm, wide, with a laugh that filled the room and a Sanata accent so exactly like the water. Yuna was born into that when Carmela said Yuna's gate name in the doorway of the club's kitchen. Us. Yuna's eyes filled before her brain caught up. Because Carmela was real. Carmela had been a big girl at the Green Gate when Yuna was a small one. Carmela had braided her hair and stolen her extra bread and held her the night the thunder came, and 30 years, and an osh, and fell away in a single embrace that smelled of orange peel and cigarettes and home. Guagliona mia, Carmela wept into her hair. Look at you. Look what you became. All the way over here. All grown. All safe. She held Yuna's face in both hands. I came to bring you home before the bad men do. I came so it would be me at your door, and not them. And Han Yuna, who reads everyone, who heard a death sentence in 9 polite words across a table full of killers, who cannot be lied to in her own second language, believed every word. Here is the thing the whole system is built to prevent, and here is the one place it cannot. Han Yuna's gift is that she hears what's under a language, but you cannot hear under the language of your own wound. The Sanata in Carmela's mouth was not information to Yuna. It was home. It was the smell of orange peel. It was the one arm that held her in the thunder, and it went in under her defenses, precisely because it did not feel like a language at all. It felt like being 6 and safe. She had read a room full of Marchetti soldiers in half a second. She could not read woman who called her sister. She could not read the one woman who called her sister, and she never even tried, because trying would have meant treating home as a threat, and she had spent 30 years unable to do that. Which is exactly why they sent Carmela, and not a killer. She read the whole world, and went blind on the one face. Kang Jai did not embrace Carmela. Kang Jai did not embrace anyone. He sat across a low table from the warm, weeping woman, while Yuna, glowing, translated the reunion, and he watched Carmela the way he watched everything. Not her words, her room, and what he saw made the scar on his throat feel cold. He saw a woman who wept exactly on the beats where weeping would land. He saw a woman whose hands, when she thought no one was reading them, did not shake at all. He saw a woman who, once for half a second, when Yuna turned to pour the tea, let her wet, warm eyes go absolutely dry and flick to the door, counting exits. The exact thing Yuna herself did in every room, the tell of a person who has been furniture. Except Carmela wasn't furniture. Carmela was a hunter, and only another hunter would ever catch it. Ask her, Kang Jae said quietly to Yuna, in Korean. Who paid for her plane ticket? Yuna laughed, embarrassed, and did not ask it. She's from the gate, she said, low, pleading. She held me in the thunder. Please. Not everyone is. Ask her. Yuna asked. Carmela's answer was beautiful. The church took up a collection. The old neighborhood pitched in. You know how it is with us. Guaglio. Nobody has money, and everybody has a little. And it was warm, and it was funny, and it was a lie. And Kang Jae watched Yuna not hear the lie. Watched the one person in his world who could not be fooled get fooled in real time by an accent. And he understood something that frightened him. More than any gun had in 20 years. Her gift had a hole in it exactly the shape of her childhood. And his enemies had found the hole before he had. He did the thing he never did. He overrode her. He said, in Korean, to his own men, without raising his voice, Our guest is tired. Give her a room, watch the room. And to Yuna, when she started to protest that Carmela should stay with her. No, just that. And Yuna felt the wall, his wall, the one that had opened for her, swing halfway shut, and she did not understand that he was not shutting her out. He was trying to stand between her and the one door she couldn't see was a trap. But it felt, to a woman who'd spent her life being overruled, exactly like being furniture again. Because Yuna could not read Carmela, she did the one thing Carmela was sent to make her do. That night, unable to bear the wall half shut, aching to prove that home was safe, that she was safe, that the past could be let into this house without burning it down. Yuna went to Carmela's watched room, and she brought her a coffee, and she sat, and she talked, and somewhere in the warmth of the sanita and the orange peel, she said the one thing Carmela had crossed an ocean to hear. She said where Kang Jai would be tomorrow. Not as a secret, as a daughter, telling her aunt about her life. He's meeting the port people at the old cannery. At noon, he hates it. He says the place smells of dead fish and dead deals. A small, warm nothing, a piece of a life she was proud to finally have, handed across a table to the one person on earth she should never have handed it to. Carmela held her hand and said, how wonderful, how far she'd come, how proud her father would be. At 12:40 the next day, at the old cannery that smelled of dead fish, a car that was not supposed to be there. Put 4 rounds through the window of a car that was. And the man in that car was not Kang Jai, because Kang Jai, who reads rooms, had smelled the wrongness of the whole week and changed the meeting to the harbor master's office at the last hour. Without telling anyone but his driver. The man in the car was Gunwoo, the driver, the one who never lit his cigarette. He took 2 of the 4 rounds meant for his boss, and he lived, barely, on a gurney under a flickering light. And when Yuna reached the hospital and saw the unlit cigarette that had fallen from his fingers lying on the corridor floor, she understood all at once, with the clean, cold horror of a person whose one gift has finally turned in her hand what she had done. She had read a death sentence across a table of strangers, and she had poured coffee for the woman who used her to write one. Here is the cruelty of the thing they built. He had learned to kneel, to hand her the phone, to bring the watch, to ask instead of command. And now, because a woman got the driver shot on a warm word Yuna gave away, all of it ran backward. He stopped handing her the phone. He stopped almost smiling. The empty space at his back, which for a few days had felt like it might one day have room for her in it, closed to a blade's width again, and Yuna stood back at her old wall and watched the fortress reassemble itself, brick by brick, and knew she had handed him the mortar. He did not blame her out loud. That would have been mercy, and this was worse than blame. He simply withdrew, efficiently, completely, the way a man who has been betrayed by trust exactly once already. 2 years ago, a cup of coffee, someone close enough to hand it to him, withdraws the second time, faster, because the second time he already knows the way. I don't blame you, he said, once, flat, not looking at her, and it was the loneliest sentence she had ever heard, because a man who has to say he doesn't blame you is a man building the wall while he says it. I should have, she started. When she said her ticket, I heard it. I heard the lie in it, and she stopped. Started again. No. That's not true. I couldn't hear it. That's worse, isn't it? If I'd heard it and ignored it, at least I'd be someone who makes mistakes. I'm someone who has she pressed the heel of her hand to her sternum, a hole, right here, shaped like being 6, and they found it before you did. She folded a napkin into a small, tight square and set it down and did not throw it away. You should send me back to the agency. He didn't answer, which was its own answer, and it was not the one either of them wanted. She could not fix the driver. She could not unclose the wall. So she did the one thing she had ever been able to do, the thing that was hers before it was ever useful to anyone. She listened. She got the old man from the phone, Rocco, back on the line, and she stopped being the frightened daughter and started being the interpreter, and she made him tell her the whole shape of it. And it was this. Her father, Han Jae-il, had been the Marchetti's neutral hand, the outsider who held the family's books because an outsider had no cousin to favor and no vendetta to feed. And in 20 years of holding the books, he had come to hold the one thing that could end Don Cesare Marchetti. A ledger, real, physical, that tied Cesare to a killing 30 years old, that the other families had been told was someone else's doing, a killing that, if proven, would bring every clan in Campania down on the Marchetti at once. Jae-il had hidden it before they killed him, and he had built the hiding place so that only his own blood could open it, verified by the one thing no enemy could counterfeit. The lullaby he sang his daughter, the moon that owes the sea a debt, sung in his own child's voice. That was why nobody could just kill her. That was why they needed her alive and willing. The ledger was a door, and Yuna was the key, and a key you break is a key you can't use. Whoever held that ledger held Don Cesare. And the Uncle Myung Sik had promised it to a rival Naples faction in exchange for the men and money to come back to Seoul and take the ring from his nephew. So, the war for the Du family, in Korea, would be won or lost by a 30-year-old, crime in a Naples church, and the only person who could open the box was the woman standing at the wall of Kang Jae's dining room with a bullet hole in the trust between them. She understood then what she had to do. And it was the worst thing she had ever chosen, and she chose it clear-eyed, which is the only way that counts. If the ledger was a door only she could open, then as long as she stood beside Kang Jae, the war would come here, to his city, onto ground he could hold. But at the price of every soul in this building, of Gunwoo twice over, of the man who never lit his cigarette catching the next 4 rounds instead of 2. And if she went there, to Naples, to the ledger, on her own, then the war would follow her onto Marchetti ground, Italian ground, where Kang Jae could not fight and would not die, and where she, the daughter of Han Jae-il, finally had a name that meant something and a card in a game she'd been a pawn in since before she could walk. She could not protect him here. She could remove herself and take the war with her, and open the door on her own terms, and decide who gets it. So, she did the thing the first night of all of this had been about, and she did it in reverse. Don't let her leave, he'd said, of a woman he wanted kept. And now, on this night, she let herself out. She wrote him nothing, because there was nothing to write that wouldn't sound like goodbye, and nothing that would make him let her go if it did. She folded one last napkin into a small tight square and set it on the black table beside the phone. The only signature she had. The one habit he'd watched 100 times and never asked about. And she left it there for him to find, because some part of her needed him to know that the person who left was the real one, the one who folded the napkins, the Sanita one, and not the plant his uncle always said she was. And she walked out past the empty space behind his chair that she had almost, for a few days, been allowed to fill. He found the napkin square at dawn. He stood over it for a long time, the man reading an empty one, and he understood everything it said, which was, I am the thing that gets you killed, so I am taking myself away, and I am doing it because I finally have something you gave me, which is the nerve to choose. He understood that she had learned to choose from watching him. He understood that she'd used it to leave him. And Du Kangjae, who has not left his own city in 9 years, who does not speak their language, who cannot win on their ground, who built a fortress precisely so that he would never again have to chase anything into the dark, picked up the phone off the table, their phone, and he looked at the folded square of paper And he said to the empty room, in the flat, quiet voice he used only when a thing was already decided, "Get the plane." He went without an army, because an army on Marchetti ground is a war, and he was not going to make a war. He was going to do the one thing his uncle would never believe he was capable of. The one thing that had no strategy in it, and no fortress and no fallback. The thing that a man who trusts no one can only do once in his life, if he does it at all. He was going to walk unarmed into his enemy's country, in a language he could not speak, to stand behind a woman who left him. Not to drag her back, not to cage her, not to keep her the way you keep a thing that's useful. To let her open the door, and to be the one standing in it when she turned around. The jet lifted over the gray city and turned toward the sea. And somewhere under it, 11 years and an ocean away, a green iron gate stood in the Sanità, and behind it a box her father built, and inside the box a dead 30 years old, waiting for a lullaby in the only voice that could sing it true. She thinks she's protecting him by leaving. She doesn't know he's already in the air, and neither of them knows that the person waiting at the gate isn't Rocco. It's the uncle. He got there first. If you made it to the end, put your city in the comments. I want to know where you're listening tonight. And if you already know whose voice sang that lullaby first, type Moon so I know you were paying attention. Part 3 is the gate. I'll meet you there. Welcome home, sweetheart. I got here first. Han Yuna had crossed an ocean to stand at a green iron gate in the Sanità, believing that here, finally, on the one ground in the world that was hers, she would have the power for once. Her father's name, her father's people, her father's box. And the man waiting at the gate was Doom Young Sik, the uncle, Kang Jai's blood, the one who'd walked out of a ruined red room with her prayer card in his fist a lifetime ago, standing now in the doorway of her childhood with a Naples clan behind him, holding out the little laminated saint like a party invitation, smiling the warm, dead smile of a man who has thought 3 moves ahead of you your entire life. Your friend Rocco's inside, he said pleasantly. A little tired. He'll live, if you're quick. He turned the Santino in the light. Here's how tonight goes. You sing your papa's little song. You open your papa's little box, and you hand me what's inside. And everyone you love keeps breathing. Refuse. The smile never moved. And this becomes a very long night in a very old city where your Korean boyfriend has no friends, no gun, and no idea which streets kill you. He was right about all of it but the last part. Because Do Kang Jai, the man who has not left his own city in 9 years, who speaks not one word of Italian, who built a fortress precisely so he'd never have to chase anything into the dark, was already in that city, already in that dark. 12 hours ahead of schedule, unarmed, alone, standing in the shadow of a church his enemies had owned for 100 years. He'd landed while she was still in the airs. Tell me your city in the comments. I want to know who came all this way with her. Because tonight a woman burns down the only power she's ever had, to finally become the one thing no one can own. She had built the whole plan on one belief. That Naples was hers. That she'd spent a life being furniture in Kang Jai's world, a foreigner reading a foreign room. And that here, finally, the accent would be hers, and the streets would be hers, and the dead man's name would open doors that had been closed to her since birth. She'd crossed an ocean to stop being the one who arrived second, and Doom Youngsik was already at the gate, already inside. Already 3 moves ahead, the way he'd been 3 moves ahead of everyone in this story. Because that was the whole terrible competence of him. Not violence, patience. The patience of a man who lets you think you're running while he waits at the place you're running to. He had done his homework in the 11 days she'd wasted being afraid. He'd found Rocco. He'd found the box. He'd found the one thing he couldn't do himself. Open it, and he'd arranged the entire ocean so that she would arrive, exhausted and alone and out of options, at the exact spot where opening it looked like mercy. And here is the thing that told her, cold, how far ahead he really was. He handed her back the Santino, freely, the prayer card he'd taken from a ruined red room a lifetime ago, the one from the nun who cut apples into 8 pieces. He pressed it into her hand at the gate like a gift. A man like Myung-sik does not return a hostage's most precious thing out of kindness. He returns it when he no longer needs it as leverage. He returns it when he's already holding something worth so much more that the card is just paper. He was holding her whole family, and he wanted her to feel it in her hand, warm from his pocket, while she understood that. Somewhere 3 alleys over, in the dark, Du Kang-jae was learning what his uncle already knew, that a king off his own ground is just a stranger in a coat. Everything that made him himself did not work here. He could not pronounce a fate and let a room fill in the blank, because he did not have the room, and did not have the language, and the blank he'd leave would just be a blank. He could not read the space at his back, because every space here was at his back. He could not summon men, because his men were an ocean away, and the men here belonged to the enemy. Insane. The fortress he'd spent his whole life building had one wall he'd never tested, and the wall was home, and he had just walked out of it into a country that did not know his name and did not care. He had one thing. He had the same thing she'd had on the first night. In a room full of men who talked over her, the perfect, useless-looking patience of someone the powerful have decided is nobody. Here, for the first time in 20 years, Du Kang-jae was nobody, a foreigner in an alley, a coat in the dark, and nobody, as a woman once taught him without meaning to, has a very good view. He didn't try to be a king in Naples. He did the harder thing, the thing he had learned from watching her stand at his wall. He made himself furniture. He stood in the dark and he watched, and he waited to be needed, instead of arriving to command, and it was the most powerful thing he'd ever done, precisely because it looked like nothing. They took her through the green gates she had not walked through in 30 years, through a courtyard where a nun had once cut apples into 8 pieces, into a small stone chapel behind the orphanage, where the candles were the only light, and the air smelled of wax and old rain, and something underneath it, something from before memory, that made her 6 years old and made her chest cave in. Rocco was on a pew, an old man, gray, a cloth pressed to his side, and when he saw her, his ruined face did something that was not fear. It was relief. "Guagyo," he breathed. "You came. I told them you'd come. I told them," a cough. "I told them you were his." In the wall behind the altar, there was an iron box, small, old, set into the stone by a man 30 years dead, and it had no keyhole, because her father had not been a man who trusted keys. It had a small brass grill, like the grill of a confessional, and behind the grill, Rocco said, a mechanism. A wire, a reed, a thing her father built with his own hands in the 20 years he held the family's darkest book that answered to one sound and one sound only. "He recorded you," Rocco whispered, "when you were small, singing, before. He built the box to open to your voice singing his song at the pitch of a child, and he swore no grown enemy could ever fake it, because a grown throat can't make a child's sound, and a stranger doesn't know the song, and even you." The old man's eyes filled. "Even you were too little to remember learning it. He hid the key inside you, Pixarella. 30 years. He bet your whole life that you'd hum it without knowing why. And Han Yuna, who had hummed 4 bars of a lullaby every time she was afraid. In a stairwell, at a wall, at a window, her whole life, and had always told herself a nun had taught it, because the truth had no name, understood at last whose voice had put the song in her mouth. Then a door opened at the back of the chapel, and Don Cesare Marchetti walked in out of the dark, and the whole room resorted itself around him, the way iron filings sort around a magnet. And Doom Young Sik's warm, dead smile faltered for exactly the half-second it takes a man to realize his ally has arrived uninvited. Cesare did not look at the uncle. He looked at Yuna a long time in the candlelight, and something moved behind his folded hands face that she had not expected and could not read, and he said, in careful Neapolitan, softly, the thing that took her whole story and turned it over like a coin. You have his eyes, J. Ills. I have been waiting 30 years to be looked at by those eyes, and to tell them the truth, because your father is owed at least that. He drew a breath. You think we killed him, the Marchetti. You have built your whole self on being the daughter of a man my family murdered. He shook his head once. We did not. Pharaoh killed your father. And here his eyes moved at last, cold, to a heavy silent man at the edge of the candlelight, a man who had come in with the uncle, Don Vito Pharaoh, who had said nothing this whole time. Pharaoh killed him for that box, and failed to open it, and blamed us, and I let the world believe it. Because the truth would have started a war that would have found you behind that gate, 6 years old. Your father held a book that could have burned me to the ground. He never used it. Instead, he used the last thing he had to buy one child 30 years of being nobody. I have protected this gate from a distance every day since, because a man who dies to make his enemy's daughter safe puts a debt on that enemy that does not expire. He inclined his silver head gravely to her. I am not here for the book, Signorina. I am here to pay what I owe the man who could have destroyed me and chose to hide you instead. She had been the daughter of a man the Marchetti killed. She was, it turned out, the daughter of a man the Marchetti owed. And the difference reorganized 30 years of her interior in a single sentence. And she understood that even the story she'd told herself about her own blood had been, like everything else, a translation, and a wrong one. Insane. And that the only person who'd never lied to her about who she was a father she couldn't remember, singing. Don Vito Pharaoh, at the edge of the light, the man who had actually killed her father, spoke for the first time, flat in dialect, to the uncle. Basta chiacchiere, falla cantare. Enough talk. Make her sing. They made her stand before the box. Some young sick on one side, warm patient, certain. Pharaoh on the other, cold, waiting to take what he'd killed for. Rocco bleeding on his pew. Cesare, still as a saint, and Yuna alone in the candlelight in front of a thing her father built with his hands, when she was too small to remember his face. Here is what you know about Han Yuna by now. Her gift is that she reads what's under a language. She heard a death sentence in 9 polite words, and she went blind, once, catastrophically, on the one voice she couldn't hear, because you cannot read the language of your own wound. And here is what this moment is. The wound, turned into the only key that works. For 31 years, she had been furniture, and then an interpreter, and then a weapon, and then a failure. And through every single version of herself, she had hummed 4 bars of a song. When the dark came, without knowing whose voice she was borrowing. And now she closed her eyes in a stone chapel full of men who wanted to own her, and she stopped translating, stopped reading, stopped being useful, stopped being nobody, and she opened her mouth and she sang. Not for them. She sang it the way a 6-year-old sings, because that was the pitch the box knew. And to reach it, she had to go back through 30 years of building herself out of nothing, until she found the small one behind the gate, who still believed a lullaby about the moon that owes the sea a debt was just a song her father sang, and not a door, and not a weapon, and not the most valuable sound in Campania. Just her father's voice, choosing her One more time, from inside a box in a wall, the men did not move. Killers, all of them, went still in the candlelight, because there is a kind of true thing that even the worst rooms fall quiet in front of, and a dead man's daughter singing his song in his own child's voice is that kind of thing. The reed behind the brass grill shivered. The mechanism her father built with his hands turned over, and the box, 30 years shut, sworn to open for no counterfeit, no stranger, no grown throat, no enemy on earth, opened for her. The thing she was most ashamed of. Being from nothing, being nobody's, being an orphan with a borrowed song, was the only key her father ever needed her to be. Inside the box, a book. Leather, cracked, 30 years old, and in it, Una read it, fast, because she is what she is. She cannot not read. The Hole's machine of the massacre, 30 years gone. Marchetti and Ferro named side by side in her father's careful hand. Dates, bodies, the lie they'd sold the other families. Everything. It was exactly what everyone had said. Whoever held it held both families. It was worth every death this story had cost, and every death it was about to. And every man in that chapel reached for it at once. Myung-sik, warm. Good girl, now hand it here, and we all go home. Because the moment she handed it to him, he'd fly it back to Seoul and trade it for the men, and the money to take the ring from his nephew, and everything. The flowers, the cannery, Gunwoo bleeding under a flickering light, would have been the down payment. Ferro, cold, hand out, because with it he'd bury his own guilt and own Cesare forever. Cesare, still, because if it burned, he was finally, after 30 years, safe. And in the doorway of the chapel, silent, unarmed, a foreigner in a black coat that nobody in Naples knew, Du Kang-jae. He had followed the only thing that could lead him. Her voice, singing, carrying out through the old stone into the alley, where he'd made himself furniture in the dark. He stood in the doorway now, with empty open hands, and he did not try to command the room, because it was not his room, and he did not reach for the book, because he had crossed an ocean unarmed for exactly one reason, and it was not the book. He met her eyes across the candlelight, and he did the last thing left in him to do. He did nothing. He did not tell her what to do. He did not decide for her. The man who pronounces fates, who never once in his life let another person choose the ending. He stood in a doorway in his enemy's country with open hands and left the choice entirely, completely, terrifyingly hers. It was the most anyone had ever trusted her with. It was the most anyone had ever loved her. She looked at the book. She looked at the men who wanted it. She looked at the boy, the whole story of who wanted what she could give, and none of them, not one. In 31 years, until a man in a doorway with empty hands had wanted her only what she unlocked. She understood, finally, the shape of her own life. She had spent it being valued for what she could do for the powerful. Pour their coffee, read their enemies, open their boxes, hold their keys. Furniture, interpreter, weapon, key, and every version had one thing in common. As long as she was worth something to them, she was a thing to be owned and hunted and traded, and the people around her got shot in canneries. The ledger was the ultimate version of it. Hold it, and she'd be the most valuable woman in 3 countries and hunted for the rest of her life, and never, ever free. So Han Yuna did the thing no one in that chapel could imagine. Because none of them had ever in their lives held power, and chosen not to keep it. She held the book to the candle. Chef-fi. Ferro lunged. Kang-jae was already between them, unarmed, immovable, a foreigner willing to die in a foreign church, and Ferro stopped, because a man with nothing to lose is the one thing violence can't price. The pages caught. 30 years of leverage, her father's careful hand, the massacre, the names, the whole machine that had made her a key. It curled and blackened, and went up in her hands in the candlelight. And she did not flinch from the heat, and her face in the orange light was wet and completely calm. And she said, to the whole room of the most dangerous men in 2 hemispheres, quietly, in the flat, certain voice she had learned from watching a man pronounce fates, "Now I'm worth nothing to any of you. There's nothing to open, nothing to trade, nothing to hunt. My father hid a key inside a little girl and bet her whole life on it. The last page blackened. I just spent it. I'm nobody again." She let the ash fall. It's the safest thing a dead man's daughter can be. Here is what happened to Do Myung-sik. He did not get a bullet. He did not get a reckoning, a satisfying executions in a Naples church. Something worse happened to him. Something truer. He became worthless. Because Myung-sik's entire play, the flowers, the cannery, the ocean, 30 years of patience, had one deliverable, and it was the book, and the book was ash. And Don Vito Ferro had crossed an ocean and spent men and money on the promise of it, and now there was nothing to deliver. And Ferro, cold, silent, looked at the uncle for one long moment in the smoke, looked at a man who had sold his own blood, his own nephew, his own family, for a thing that had just burned in a girl's hands. And Ferro did the most contemptuous thing one killer can do to another. He turned around and walked out, and his men walked out past Myung-sik without touching him, without looking at him, the way you walk past furniture, the way you walk past nothing, and left him standing alone, in the smoke of the thing he'd traded everything for. No one held a gun on him. No one needed to. He had made himself the one thing his patience could not survive. Useless. A man who betrays his blood for leverage, holding a fistful of ash. He would fly home to a ring that now knew what he'd done. Kang Jae would see to that, quietly, the way he did everything, and he would find, in Seoul, no army, no allies, no nephew's trust, and no book to buy any of it back. Kang Jae looked at his uncle across the emptying chapel. 30 years of blood, the man who raised him after his father died, and he did not pronounce a fate. He didn't have to. The blank was already filled. He simply, very slightly, turned his shoulder, which, in the grammar of the man he was, meant, "You are nothing to me now." Meant, go stand by the wall of the rest of your life. And Do Myung-sik understood it, because he had taught his nephew that gesture, and he left the chapel a discarded man, and that was the end of him. And it was colder than any grave. They went home. Not because the war was won. Wars like that don't end. They just lose their reason to find you. But because home was, for the first time, a place that meant a person and not a fortress. Gunwoo lived. Weeks later, he stood by the car with a cane, and, for the first time in all of this, he took the cigarette out of his mouth and he lit it, slow. And he breathed the smoke out into the ordinary Seoul daylight. And Yuna understood that the driver only smoked when the danger was over, that the unlit cigarette had always been him waiting, and that a lit one meant he'd decided they were, for now. All right. He didn't say anything to her about the cannery. He just, once, tipped the lit cigarette toward her, a half-inch, a small salute, we're square, and went back to watching the street. Rocco healed at the gate. Cesare, 30-year debt discharged. Sent one thing across the ocean, no note. A photograph, cracked, of a Korean man in a Naples courtyard in the 1990s, laughing, holding a baby who was too small to remember being held. Her father's face, the one thing no one had ever been able to give her. She folded it into a small, tight square and set the photograph on it, and she still never explained the folding, and no one ever asked. The last of this story has no gun in it, because the most important things never made a sound. It's the 4th floor room, the black table, late, quiet, the two of them. She pours the coffee the way she has poured it 100 times since a night. She answered a phone in a language no one thought she spoke. And this time, Du Kang Jie, a man who has not drunk a cup he didn't watch, get poured in 2 years, a man who was poisoned once by someone close enough to hand it to him, a man who built a fortress out of never again, lifts the cup and drinks, without watching, without checking, without a flicker. He doesn't say I'd trust you. He doesn't say I love you. Men like him don't, and the story is too honest to hand you the line. He just drinks the coffee she poured, with his eyes on her, instead of on the cup, and in the grammar of a man who has spent his whole life reading rooms and pronouncing fates and standing so no one could get behind him. Drinking a cup you didn't watch get poured is the loudest thing he has ever said to another human being. You're worth nothing now, he says, and it's her own phrase from the chapel, turned once more, and the ghost of the third smile she's ever seen crosses his scarred face. No key, no book, nothing to trade. He sets the cup down, empty, nothing anyone would cross an ocean for. He looks at her across the black table, across everything, except me. I already did. She almost tells him the last thing then. She doesn't. She folds it into a small, tight square and keeps it, the way she keeps everything. Because some things you hold and don't hand over. Here's what she never told him. Here's the thing she folded up and kept. She's an interpreter. She reads what's under a language, and she cannot not read, and in the seconds before she burned her father's ledgers in a stone chapel in the Sanata, the whole massacre, the names, the dates, the machine that controlled 3 families. Han Yuna read every single line. The book is ash, but she has a mind built by 31 years of holding what she wasn't allowed to say, of standing at walls with the best view in the room, of keeping her face empty while her chest caved in. Every name, every date, the whole thing. She carries it now where no fire can reach, and no enemy can search, and no box can be broken into. The ledger was a key, and a key can be taken. She is a vault, and a vault walks around drinking coffee and folding napkins, and looking like nobody, which is the safest and most dangerous thing a dead man's daughter has ever been. Cesare doesn't know. Pharaoh doesn't know. The uncle, wherever the smoke left him, doesn't know. Only one person knows. The man who drank the coffee, and that. A woman worth nothing, holding everything, chosen by the one man who never wanted the everything. Only her is where the story rests. Not resolved. At rest, which is different and rarer, and the only kind of ending people like them ever get. She spent her father's 30-year gift to become nobody. She just forgot to tell everyone she remembers every word. Somewhere across an ocean, one old clan is starting to wonder what the girl saw before the pages burned. If you rode all the way to the end of this, put your city in the comments one more time. I read every single one, and I want to know who stayed. And if you understood what she's really carrying now, type Vealt, so I know. There's more of them. More rooms, more walls, more people the powerful decided were nobody. I'll bring you the next one. Stay close.